groups. But I think one important thing to note is that Cuban Americans are more likely to be registered voters. Cuban Americans are more likely to be engaged in the political process. They're also more likely to be U.S. citizens. So in many respects, while the Salvadoran population has grown rapidly and might be on the verge of passing the Cuban community in size, the Cuban community is much more likely to be engaged in the nation's elections. Finally, we did a survey recently, and we asked Latinos about who's the nation's most important national leader. As you can see, Marco Rubio was named as one of those leaders. 5% named Marco Rubio across all Latinos nationwide. But you could also see how differences in the naming of a leader depends on the different groups that one is talking about. So if we look at Mexicans, for example, Sotomayor and Villaraigosa are the most named, but Villaraigosa was the mayor of Los Angeles, which has a large Mexican community. Puerto Ricans, Sotomayor, 11% named her. She's of Puerto Rican origin. But among Cubans, there's more named a leader, and fewer said they didn't know. So 25%, 1/4, identified Marco Rubio as the most important national Latino leader today. Only 45% said, fewer than half, said that they didn't know who the nation's most important leader is, and 10% said no one. But you can see how different that assessment is for Cuban Americans compared with other groups. I'm going to stop there. I hope that was under 15 minutes. Was that under 15 minutes? Record time? Do you want me to talk some more? Oh, I have 10 more minutes? Oh, jeez. Well, a few other things. In terms of our work at the Pew Research Center, if you're interested in taking a look at any of this data, most of this data is now publicly available. So for those of you who are students looking for dissertations, our data is publicly available at pewresearch.org/Hispanic. And we plan to continue to do more work looking at the nation's Cuban-American in addition to other communities in the course of the next year, particularly around politics, but also demographics. So keep an eye out for those things. So thank you.
Now we turn to Dr. Eduardo Gamarra from the Department of Politics and International Relations at FIU.
Thank you. There's a height requirement for presenting this morning, as you can tell. So it's always good to join Mark on a panel. We participated in something not too long ago, sort of looking at some of these trends. And the most recent poll that Pew did on Hispanic leadership, I think, was really is a very, very interesting poll, because it essentially concludes that Latinos in the United States have no identifiable leaders other than at the local level. And of course, from the perspective of moving legislation forward, that is, in my view, it should be our most significant concern. Okay, well, what I'd like to do today is present the results of a survey that we conducted in October. It's a survey that in some measure comes on the heels of a controversy that developed in the aftermath of the 2012 elections. And so the title of my presentation is, Did Cuban Americans Really Vote for President Obama? What I'd like to do is just simply go to the controversy, since I only have 15 minutes, and I will probably use them all. If you recall, in November, immediately after the elections, exit polls, all exit polls, boldly proclaimed that Cuban Americans had voted. The majority of Cuban Americans had voted for President Obama, and that has become essentially conventional wisdom, and it hasn't only been reproduced in most media coverage of that election, but certainly it also has been reproduced in many academic studies. And some of you may recall that last year our department, in conjunction with the Miami Herald, did 2 polls immediately before the elections. And what we found in those polls, and some of my colleagues, Astrid, for example, who's here, you will recall that we were pretty convinced 2 weeks before the elections that Republicans were going to vote very different than the rest of Latinos in Florida and even in the city of Miami. But we certainly, and we expected a certain group of Cuban-Americans to move into the Democratic camp, but we certainly didn't expect Democrats to win the Cuban-American vote. And so we were very surprised by the exit polls, and those exit polls, of course, were reproduced in let's call them sources of media as far to the left as CNN and as far to the right as Fox, as the wisdom of the day, as I said, and I pointed out some of these sources. You can go to them. I'm going to leave the presentation here with CRI. Sergio Bendixen, the pollster, argued then that older Cubans who tend to be more conservative are dying off. And this is an argument that has been really strong here. Los viejitos están muriendo, los jóvenes son más liberales, and they're voting, increasingly for Democrats. And since Cuba is no longer an issue in the campaign, then Cubans are now freer to vote their conscience, perhaps, their social conscience. A couple of days later, they did a precinct analysis, and the precinct analysis suggested that, in fact, the split was much higher, that it was about 52 to 48%. 52 for Obama and 48 for Romney. And on election day, the polls argued, those Cuban Americans who voted on election day, not those who voted via absentee ballots and so on, tended to be much more Democratic than others. This became an interesting controversy, and one that kind of got those of us who did the polls before in a little bit of trouble, because we began to question the results of our numbers, and we ran them again and again, and we came up with the very same answers. Professor Moreno, who's sitting in the back and really needs no introduction, and Professor Hill, also from our department, ran a very interesting study right in the middle of this, and they concluded, I think quite significantly, that at least 55% and a maximum of 59% of the county's Cuban-American voters favored Romney. Quite a different result than what this exit poll had found. Now, nonetheless, the Moreno-Hill study concluded that certainly the Democrats were gaining, and historically, of course, this is important, as Mark has pointed out. This is a graph taken from the study from the exit poll by Bendixen, and what you see here, it's very clear. There is an erosion in identification with the Republican Party over the past 20 years, quite significant, a little different than your data. But the real issue, of course, is the 2012 results and how accurate those were, because I think it's clear that the trend is going in that direction. It's clear that President Obama and the Democrats have made important gains, especially among younger Cubans and those born in the U.S., and you'll see the results in a moment. But the question today is, what are the real numbers? And before I go into the poll, I want to reiterate something that Mark just said. It is extraordinarily difficult to conduct this research, and Dario is probably the person that knows most about this, because when you register to vote, you don't put your national origin on the voter registration. So the only way to approximate this now that we have is through public opinion polls. And that of course gives you a variety of answers. The margin of error on this poll is about 4.7%. So up or down, you can see some variation in these results. But what we found, however, is that, and I'll just put it out this way, that the FIU Miami Herald poll was not wrong. Okay, that in fact the results tend to ratify what we found 2 weeks before the election. So the question is, did Cubans change their minds after the election? And that's an issue I want to address in a moment. But what our survey tells us is that the erosion has continued, but not to the extent that others have claimed. Other polls don't account for other party or no party identification. And as I said, it is clear that the Democratic Party has made a gain. But again, if you look at the results of our poll here, that gain is not that significant. Now, granted, you might say a year after the vote, and especially, although I'm not going to report it in this presentation, but when you ask, do you approve of President Obama? A year after President Obama has been in office, and with all that has been happening, and when you look at his national figures right now at about 39% of approval, among Cubans it's even lower. So when you look at that, you might say that people who voted for President Obama might have regretted voting for President Obama, so when we went and polled them, they might have changed their minds. But that doesn't account for these differences that we're finding. All right? When you look at age, does age make a difference? And here I think the exit polls and most of the data that's available there is correct. All right? That 18 to 24-year-olds are the ones that are identifying most with the Democratic Party. But if you look among the older Cuban Americans, they are still solidly Republican. And this, to me, is really important because it's not just those that are about to die. It's not just los viejitos que se están muriendo. It really is, those above 25 years old that are still staunchly Republican. And that, I think, of course, it calls for greater research than I've been able to provide. Again, looking at the data, are women more conservative than men? It looks like Cuban-American women are a little bit more Republican than their male counterparts. But this is where some of the differences really come to play. That the earlier you arrived in the United States, of course, the more Republican you tend to be. And this, again, is very consistent with all of the research over the last 25 years. And again, if you look at this, it's quite striking how this begins to shape up in the next decades. If you look at the 1980s to 1990s, again, fairly consistent. All right, and I worked with a Mariel exodus, and frankly, that was the Marielitos who came in 1980. I interviewed over 4,000 Marielitos in a previous life, and what I had assumed then was that there would be a change in party identification among that group, but as Dario Moreno also knows, Marielitos have been just as Republican as their parents who had arrived here 2 decades earlier. And when you go into this is where the change really begins to show up in the 2000 to the present. The question was, when did you arrive and into the U.S.? So those Cubans who have arrived after 2000 are really showing some interesting party identification numbers. Right? And so if there's something to look at, it is this. This is where the trend is. Now, the problem is that in this sample, this is a very small number of people. All right, and we did weigh the survey by 2 things. We weighted by age and we weighted by time of arrival, just to try to give ourselves some greater balance in terms of the results. But yet, it is fairly clear that those who have arrived after 2000, and these are registered voters, all right? And in the filter questions, we asked, did you vote in 2012? So these are registered voters who say they voted in 2012, all right? Okay, and